Welcome to the first video in the mini-series, The Mathematics of Voting. So here's the situation. We have 48 voters and we ask each of them to list their top candidate in an election. So the candidates are A, B, C, D, and E, and we ask each person, just list your top candidate. So after that, we have the results organized in this table. We see that 21 people voted A as their top choice, 20 people voted B as their first choice, 5 voted E, and 2 voted D. And sadly, no one voted C. But here's the result of the election, and from everything we know about government, democracy, elections, most of us would say that A is the apparent winner of this election, just barely beating out B. Now that's all well and good, and this is known as the Plurality Method, which is a method that's used widely throughout the United States, where you ask each person their top candidate, and whoever gets the most votes wins. Now that seems fair, doesn't it? Well, it does seem fair until you look at what's going on underneath. Let's say instead of asking people only their first choice, we ask them to rank all 5 of these candidates from first to 5th choice. And let's say we have that data here. So now we have a lot more information, and let's see how this affects whether we think the right choice has been made or not. Well, let's look at first something. These 21 people voted A as their first choice, but where does A appear for these other 27 people? He appears at the bottom. These people do not like him at all. That seems a little fishy for someone who just won an election. Now let's look at something else. Let's look at another top competitor, B. We see that B has just lost by 1 vote if we consider only the first choice. But let's look at where B lies for the other people. These 20 people voted B just below A. These 20 people wanted B as their first choice. These 5 people voted B just second place. And these 2 people voted B as the third choice. So it seems that B is much higher on average than A. And let's try to illustrate that using kind of like a graph here. So what I've drawn here is a graph. And we're just kind of going to match up each of the data as we see it. So here's the first block of voters, these 21 voters. Where do they vote? Where do they put A? So I'm going to go ahead and put them up here as first place. Where did this next batch of voters put A? They put them at the very bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and put them at the very bottom. And same thing for this batch of voters, same thing for these batch of voters. So if we go ahead and play a little connect the dots and we connect where does A lie on average, we see that he starts off strong here. But then as we get to the other block of voters, he's pretty low. Now let's look at B and let's look at how he ranks in comparison. Well, B, this block of voters put B where? They put him second to first, so he's second place candidate. This block of voters put him at the very top. This block of voters put him second place. And this block of voters put him in third place. So if we connect his dots now, we see this trend. Now, let's say you didn't have all this data in front of you, and you just had this graph, and you knew that this was candidate B, and this was candidate A. So we're going to ignore the other candidates because their graphs aren't as good average. But let's look at this. Now, who would you think would win this election? Well, I personally would say B, and many people would say B because he has an overall higher curve here, and he has much more voters, it seems, overall than A. And that is true to an extent. So we see that if we look at all the data and we ask people to vote not just their first choice, but they rank their choices, we see a much better, much clearer picture. And that's what math is all about, gathering as much information as possible so we can make the best possible choice. So now let's talk a little bit about why this happened. Why? By just looking at the top choice, we got one answer, but by looking at all the data together, we got a different answer. And this is a lot of the shortcomings of the plurality method, which we use in a lot of elections. So we're going to talk about 3 major shortcomings. So the first shortcoming of the plurality method is that it's a weak form of something called the majority criterion. The majority criterion says this. It's related to the plurality method, but it's a little bit stronger. This says that the winner of an election should have more than 50% of the votes. So we'll write winner greater than 50% of the votes. And is that true for the A, who was the winner of this under the plurality method? So we see that there were 48 voters. What's half of 48? It's going to be 24. So the winner needs 25 or more votes. Well, A only had 21 votes, and he still won. So according to the majority criterion, he's not a majority candidate, which means he did not get more than 50% of the votes, which means under this criterion, he should not be dubbed a winner. That doesn't mean he should be dubbed a loser. It just means we should use some other method to try to figure out who's the rightful winner of this election. So the plurality method, which says that you just have to go with whoever has the most votes, is a weak form of the majority criterion. And why is this bad? Well, if we just obey the majority criterion, at least we have some confidence that the person who won, who has more than 50% of the votes, is a strong candidate. But in this case, with A beating B by just one vote, we're not totally sure if he's that strong of a candidate or if B would be the better choice overall by looking at this whole table. So that's the first shortcoming of the plurality method. What's the second shortcoming? Well, in this, we're going to have to do a little bit of analysis. We're going to compare each candidate head to head. So we're going to do compare A with B, we're going to compare A with C, compare A with D, compare B with C, B with D, and C with D. So the reason I didn't do like a BA comparison here is because we already did an AB comparison, so that's already been done. So what are we going to do with each of these? First, let's look at A and B. Now, what does this mean? This means if there was a race just between the candidates A and B, who would win? And here's how we're going to determine that. We're going to look here. These 21 people, if there was just the race between A and B, who would they vote? Well, they would vote A because that's higher on their list. So now A has 21 votes. So we're going to go ahead and write 21. And now B, how much votes would he get? These 20 people, would they vote B or A? They would vote B because he's higher on their list. So B has 20 votes here. These 5 people, they would vote B because he's higher up on their list. So he has 25 now. And these 2 people would also vote B over A. So B gets 27 votes. So it's 21 to 27. For the winner is B. Now if we compare A and C, let's see what happens. A gets 21 here. He's the winner here. A does not win any of these, so he's only getting 21. And C gets how much? Well, he's going to get the rest, so he's going to get 27. And the winner here would be C. Now, A versus D, it's going to be the same thing, right? Because A is at the bottom here. So it's going to be, again, a 21 to 27 difference, and we're going to have D as the winner. Now, if we look at B and C, who's ranked higher? So B is ranked higher here. So that's 21 for him. He's ranked higher here, so now we're at 41. He's ranked higher here, so we're at 46. He's not ranked higher here. So we're at 46 to 2, but still B wins. Now look at BD. We have 21, we have 41, we have 46, and we have, he doesn't win this one. So it's going to be the same result, 46 and 2, but still the winner is B. And last thing we'll look at is C versus D. So let's just look at C versus D. C wins here for 21 votes. He does not win here. So C loses here, C loses here. So that means C gets 21 votes and D gets 27 votes, and the winner will be D in this case. So now why did we just do all that work? Because I would like to look at who won in each case. So let's look at first, did A ever lose in any of these elections? Yes, he in fact lost in this one. So A is not going to be the total winner. He did not win all of his contests. Did C win all of his contests? Well, he won this one. He lost this one. So C will not be the total winner. Did D lose any of his contests? Well, he won this one. He lost this one right here. But what about B? Did B win all of his contests? Well, B won this one. He won this one. He won this one. So head to head, which means that doing pairwise comparisons, which means we take each person versus each other person, B wins every single time. And doesn't that kind of feel like B should be the winner? This is just a different criterion. So usually when we think about the winners of an election, we think about, oh, most first place votes. We don't think about this because it's kind of more complicated. But now that we have this in front of us, already done, it seems very convincing that B should be the winner because against each person, he wins. And this has a name. This comparing each candidate to each other candidate has a special name. It's called the Condorcet Criterion, after a Frenchman of the same name, Condorcet. So the Condorcet Criterion says what? The Condorcet Criterion says that the winner of an election should be the person that, when you pair him up with every other person, he wins. And in that case, that was B, and that was no other candidate in this election. So the Condorcet Criterion says that B should be the winner of the election. But what do we see? The plurality method says that A should be the winner of the election. So we say that the plurality method violates. It violates the Condorcet criterion because they do not always give the same winner. That's the second shortcoming of this method, because it doesn't take into account all the information. It only takes into account this much information. So we violate the Condorcet criterion, which is a very convincing criterion. And what is the last shortcoming of this method? This is probably the most important shortcoming. And this is called voter insincerity. So think about this. Let's go back to our table really fast and let's see. So these 21 people voted A. they probably are talking to these other 21 people amongst themselves, and they're all choosing to vote A, so they seem pretty confident. These 20 people are voting B. They also seem pretty confident. These 5 people, less confident, but still kind of confident that maybe E can get has a possible way to win. But what about this? If these 2 people are talking to each other, they know they're the only ones voting for D. And often this is how elections work. All this information is not private. You often know how different people, different states are going to vote. So if these 2 people know that they're the only ones voting for D, they kind of know that D has no chance to win this election. So they say that, well, if D has no chance to win this election, why don't we just vote for someone who does have a chance so we don't waste our vote? So this is going to be the key word, waste our vote. Nobody wants to waste their vote on someone who's not going to win. So what if these 2 people instead voted like this? So I'm going to put in black what they're now voting like because they don't want to waste their vote. They're going to put B, D, C, E, A. So all they really did, they took D, C, and they moved it down. They put B at the top. But what does this do? Now, using the plurality method, who wins? We have 21 people voting for A. How many people are voting for B in their first choice? We have 22 people voting for B. And that means under the plurality method, who's the winner now? It's going to be B with 22 over 21 votes, so he won by 1 vote. But what's the real case? These 2 people are really rooting for D. They want D to win. But since they know that he's not going to win, they don't want to waste their vote, so they vote for someone they don't like as much, so they'll still kind of have a say. So why is this bad? This is bad because often for candidates to get funding in the next year's election, they need a certain percentage of votes. And let's just say for this example's sake that percent is 4%. So if a candidate gets 4% or more of the vote, they'll get funding for next year. So that means that A, B, and E are set. Even if any of them don't win, as long as they get this many votes, they'll get funding for next year. But it turns out that 2 divided by 48 is a little bit over 4%. So if D loses his 2 votes, he's not getting any of the vote, and he's not getting funding for next year either, which is pretty bad because that means whatever he stood for, whatever those 2 people liked in his ideal system, whatever they enjoyed about the candidate, they're not going to be able to enjoy that next year because he's not going to get funding, he's not going to be able to run. So this kind of puts down third-party candidates. So talking in American terms, we have 2 major parties, but we also have a lot of third parties. And these parties often don't get the vote they need because people don't want to waste their vote. So even if they support the candidates, they'll vote for somebody else to not waste their vote. But that just means that they don't go over this. Often it's actually, in the real world, it's 5% that they need for funding. They don't get the 5% because people who would have voted for them don't, to not waste their vote, and they don't get represented. So that's a big problem with the plurality method as well. So we see that these 1, 2, 3 major shortcomings of this method. And if there's so many shortcomings, why do we still use it? Honestly, I believe it's a case of simplicity. When you go to a voting station, often people just want to write down their first candidate. They don't want to sit there and think about who's my first, second, third, fourth, fifth candidate. It often takes time. Maybe it's too complicated, costly, maybe things like that. But honestly, you need to look at the big picture. It's the only way to get a more fair method. A more fair candidate to win this election. So in the coming videos, we'll talk about better methods that do take into account all this information that will give a more fair election. And we'll also look at why those methods have their shortcomings, but also why they are good. So until next time.